All righty. Good morning. Thankful that you've all made it here this morning. We are thankful for the sunshine, yes. Thankful for the rain, too. Someone was saying yesterday, I don't remember who it was, but, it was Kerry Clark, who will be doing our gospel meeting here in March. We were at the Give Me the Bible program yesterday. He said an old Army saying was, if you pray for rain, you better be ready for the mud. And so we're thankful for the rain, but sometimes we go, wait, that's too much. But now we have sunshine. We're thankful for that. We're going to be in 1 Corinthians chapter 4 this morning. 1 Corinthians chapter 4. And we're going to, I've got notes through verse number 10. We'll see how we do. 1 Corinthians chapter 4, beginning of verse number 1 there. Again, just a little bit of background. They're coming out of idolatrous, paganist ways, which was an issue for them, just as it was an issue for the Jews who were trying to bring Judaism into Christianity. And so they're not so far off from what we're looking at with the Jews. But chapter 4 is going to conclude the first major point that Paul has been making through chapter 1 and into now, which is divisions. It's divisions. What is Paul going to be covering here in these first 5 verses? Let a man so consider us as servants of Christ and stewards of the mystery of God. Moreover, it is required in stewards that one be found faithful. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or by a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself, for I know nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this. But he who judges me is the Lord. Therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will bring both to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. What is Paul saying in these 5 verses? What's he talking about? Remember, they had divisions. He's saying that Paul and Apollos, they were putting them up on pedestals. Who's a better preacher? Who's a better speaker? They were holding them in a higher rank than they should have. We looked a few weeks back at where God's field, where God's building, where God's temple. He tells them, I don't want you to lift us up. And now we get to chapter 4, and he says, here's how you need to consider us as servants and as stewards of the mystery of God. So Paul is seeming to be writing here in verses 1 through 5 that they were using the wrong standard of judgment. Paul and Peter were the apostles that they shouldn't have been lifting up. Or excuse me, they should have. If anyone was going to be lifted up, would the apostles not be lifted up? That would be a logical thing to do. But Paul continually pleaded with them, you need to stop elevating men, all the way from chapter 1 until chapter 4 here. He said, let a man so, or in this manner. Let a man so consider us. That there's been a foundation that's been laid all the way through chapter 1 through chapter 4 now, or chapter 3, that or how they should have been viewing Paul and Apollos and all those who are teaching to them. Again, God's field, God's building, God's temple. The point is you belong to God and not us? We didn't save you. Why are we being exalted in your minds above God? He's the one that deserves exaltation. He's the one that deserves praise. He says, consider us. Here is how you count us. You need to look at us as servants of Christ. You need to look at us as stewards. We're taking care of the mysteries of God. That is how the Corinthians needed to see Paul. And this is how we must see each other. We are servants. We are stewards of the gospel. The Greek word there for servant is not what we normally find for the word servant. Now, a lot of times we're going to see servant. We see bondservant or slave. That's doulos. We've seen that before. You have the word minister, which is diakonos or deacon. We've seen that. But this word here for servant is huperetes. Any guess of what that might mean? It is a subordinate. It's an assistant. We are servants. We are subordinates to Christ. He's the one who's in charge. He says, look, if you are trying to put us at rank, here it is. We are under Christ. We serve under Him. He's the head. I show up and I do the Master's will. That's what Paul's trying to point out to them. What about a steward? What is their role? What does a steward do?
Isn't a steward and a servant the same thing? Or can it be?
I think they're very similar. I'm not sure they're exactly the same, but I think they're very similar. They are entrusted to accomplish a task for the master, a steward, right? You think about the unjust steward who didn't do anything with his talent, and then you have those who did. They went out and they used it. So I think they're very similar. Yes, ma'am. Essentially, a steward, you are in charge of someone else's stuff. And so here, you're in charge of God's truth. You're in charge of God's gospel. You're God's. I don't own you. I am a caretaker of God, or of God's possessions. Paul does not want to be put up on a pedestal. He is simply there to guide them. He's teaching them, but he's working alongside with them. Where has he been pointing them back to this entire time? Christ. Up. You need to look up. Don't look at me. He's directing them to God. And so therefore, opinions need to stay out of it, because God's message is the key. It all belongs to God, Paul's saying. He says, I'm just relaying the message. I'm just the messenger. Verse number 2, it is required, or moreover, as a steward, I must be found faithful, or I will no longer be a good steward. If I'm not faithful, I'm not a good steward. So this pairs together there. I'm a servant, I'm a steward of the mystery, and since I am that, I must be faithful. Because if I am not faithful, then my stewardship is no longer beneficial to me or to the one in whom I'm stewarding for. Let's look at verse number 3. But with me it is a very small thing that I should be judged by you or a human court. In fact, I do not even judge myself. What do you think he's saying there?
I don't care what you think about me. I'm doing Christ's work.
Okay. I would agree along those lines. Maybe not exactly that, but along those lines. Essentially, as they were placing these men up on pedestals, and Paul is better, or Apollos is better, or Cephas is better, it's kind of like Paul saying, for you to go over my resume and then to see what I've done, that's the least of my concerns. I don't want you to look at what I've done or haven't done. Them elevating these men, they were going over the resume. Well, Paul did this over here and he taught me. I like that teaching. That's Paul's resume in my mind. Or Apollos did this and that and this, and that's his resume in my mind. Paul is Paul. Yes, sir. This is Paul.
I was thinking about verse 3 as far as an application for today, that too many times we may be judging a brother or sister based on what we think they should be doing.
Sure.
And yet, so Paul is saying that, I'm not affected by your opinion of what I am or am not doing. I'm focused on what God wants me to do. And he's going back to chapter 3. We're talking about where he's building and how he's building that foundation.
Yes,
how
absolutely.
It's going to be tested
To
by
be
fire.
mindful of it, yes.
Yeah. So.
No, that's a great point, because here in just a minute, in verse number 4, you're going to see exactly what our Paul just discussed. Anything else on that? Alrighty. So Paul is the Apostle Paul. He's an educated man. He is an apostle of Jesus Christ. Peter is an apostle, but maybe he's not as polished as Paul. But then Apollos, that guy could preach. He was mighty in the Scriptures, is what the text reads back in Acts. He was one who could present the word in a manner that people loved to hear. Not that he was itching their ears, but that he was a great orator. And Paul says, excuse me, we don't care about that. That's not our goal. We don't want you to lift us up. We are stewards and servants of God. When men start caring about the resumes, how much we've accomplished, especially as a preacher, we need to stop preaching. If that becomes our goal, I've done this, this, and this, I've been on this many lectureships, I've done this many gospel meetings. If that becomes our aim, we're no longer about Christ. We're no longer servants and stewards of God. We're trying to serve ourselves. He says, that I should be judged by you or by a human court. So along the same lines here, I don't need to stand before a jury and let you determine who I am, which is what Brother Paul just said here. We know who we are. We know how we're serving God. Other people may look out from the outside and say, well, they're not serving Him properly or according to my standards. But are we serving God according to His standards is all that matters. It's interesting that he uses human court. We've seen the word human a few times in 1 Corinthians here. It's been mentioned with human wisdom a handful of times. But I found that interesting. Judged by you or a human court. It's not that you're different than a human, but that I don't have to stand before a jury of my peers or superiors and be judged by them if I'm serving God properly. When we are preaching and teaching the gospel, our focus should be us doing the absolute best to present the message. Our ego is not important. Our rank is not important. And that's what Paul is trying to draw their minds to as he's beginning to conclude here this statement or this thought of divisions here in chapter 1 through 3. We're stewards, we're servants, and how we serve matters. How we serve matters. Now, this is in context for preachers, but this is applicable for every Christian, is it not? Because a preacher is a Christian first, yes? We have to be Christians first. And so it is applicable to all of us today. Now, in the context, we want to be mindful of it, that Paul is talking here about preachers. He even says, I don't judge myself. I don't judge myself. What would he be meaning in that phrase? Bill's got a comment up here.
You know, it's not up to us to judge ourselves. What we need to do is try to follow the Lord's commandments as close as we can, try to work for the Lord and obey Him, and stay close to Him as much as we can. But we still are not worthy then. It's up to the Lord, to God Himself, to judge our worthiness, and if He finds us worthy, to give us eternal life in that day.
Yes, sir. No, that's a great point, especially if we get to the end of verse number 5. It's going to say, then each one's praise will come from God. Mark, I think Paul has a comment over here. Each one's praise is going to come from God. If we get caught up in the, well, I'm a better speaker than so-and-so, or I've done more things than so-and-so, we're trying to rank ourselves. We're concentrating on the wrong things. Yes, sir.
So I was kind of looking at this morning. You know, the idea of judging yourself. I find this with myself is that, first of all, I'm my own worst critic. And so when we look at ourselves and we are our own worst critic, in Philippians chapter 4, verse 8, you know, it talks about, brethren, whatever things are true, whatever things are noble, whatever things are just, whatever things are pure, and it goes on.
Think on these things.
We don't focus on those things. You know, we focus on the things that are completely opposite. Whatever are lovely. Well, we don't focus on what is lovely. Whatever things are good, you know, we don't focus on that. And so we self-destruct ourselves.
Yes.
And we do this. And so thinking about what Paul is saying, that if we judge ourselves, that we're going to be ineffective in our work.
Yes, that is a good point.
And
Good
so,
point.
I don't know if that's what Paul's thinking, but that's what
No, that's
I'm
a good point.
thinking.
Wes and I had the privilege to be down in the prison Thursday for the Voyager program. And a shameless plug again, men, if you want to help with that, get with Greg, myself, Alex, any of us, and we can get you signed up so you can get down in the prison with us, and you get out every time, I promise. The topic was overcoming fear and anger. You'd be surprised how open some of those guys were that night, what they actually feared. A lot of them were along the lines of inadequacy. A lot of them were kind of like what Paul was just saying here. They put those negative thoughts in, and they don't let the good, they never let them out. They only let the negative in, they don't let the good out, or they don't let the good in. One of the ones that I found most interesting, this is kind of a side note, we're not even in 1 Corinthians anymore. A couple of the guys, they said, the thing I fear most is walking out those doors. And I asked them, because I was interested in that. And they said, in here, I have to change. In here, I have to behave. In here, I talk to my wife or my kids over a phone, but I'm afraid of what's going to happen when I step out the door and I have to interact with them in person. Or I have to be back out in society. I'm afraid of that. I thought that was interesting. So men, if you have the time and the willingness to serve in that, you would be blessed going down there. I promise you. Back to 1 Corinthians. I don't even judge myself. So we talked about it. If I start comparing myself to others, I'm better than this, or I do more things than this person, and we're trying to rank ourselves, we're concentrating on the wrong things. We're no longer being servants and stewards of God's mysteries. I'm not justified by how good I think I am. For I know nothing against myself, yet I am not justified by this, but he who judges is the Lord. Now, Paul isn't aware of anything he's doing wrong, but that's irrelevant. It really is. He's using a term here that's associated with the conscience, with the mind. Even if my conscience is clear, even if I think I'm not doing anything wrong, I'm not justified by that. There's a lot of good people who have clear consciences that are still not right with God. I am not made right with God because my conscience says I am. Because our conscience can be fine and we can still not be correct. We may be sincere, but if we are not right with God, sincerity does not matter. It's not going to save us. That's true of the lost. It's true of this preacher. It's true of the Christian. Was Paul sincere when he was persecuting the church? Acts chapter 23 and verse number 1. He sought to lay waste to it. And as we get further on in the New Testament, he's going to say, my conscience was clear. He was doing it with a clear conscience. That did not make it right. We need to be careful. He says, I don't know anything against myself. I'm not even justified by that. I can say I'm good and I'm perfect, all that I want. But that doesn't save me. I need to be sure that I am following after the things that God has put forth. And then he says, he who judges me is the Lord. The opinion that Paul cares about is God's. That's the only one that matters. That's why he brings up, I'm being a steward, I'm being a servant of him. I am a subordinate. That's what the word huperetes, the servant of Christ, means. I am subordinate, and therefore I must be faithful. I must be faithful. Any questions or comments on verses 1 through 4 so far? You got one up here. It's funny, it's like you're casting out a line, you're waiting for a bite. Who's going to answer?
Well, I just feel like that the devil is going to use whatever, and it's amazing how even we as Christians, we allow pettiness, thoughts, negativity, what others think of us. We allow so much to be in our mind that's really taken the place of what we could be doing,
Yes.
focusing on the Lord's work, growing in Christ. But the devil will use whatever. And you think about, we as Christians, we're already his children. And the devil is not after those in the world. He's after us.
That's right. He wants to get you
And
away
he's
from
going to use whatever means. And, in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, and everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. Anyway, on down, he says 27, but I discipline my body
daily.
and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself
Become disqualified.
should become disqualified.
Yes, ma'am. No, that's a great point. The devil's good at his tactics, yes. He's good at it. And one of the things the Corinthians are having issues with the divisions, it starts with the letter P. Pride. Yes, sir.
I just think it's important as you read that, and he's talking about that. In Romans, he talks about, who am I to judge another man's servant, which is kind of the same thing.
Yes.
But he's talking about that God is able to make him stand. It's easy for us to look outside and see others and their mistakes and say, hey, you're messing up or whatever, you're
Yes.
not going to be worthy or whatever. But the bottom line is we have to understand none of us are worthy. None of us are justified in our works. It is God's grace and mercy that is going to save us. And Paul realizes that, as wonderful as an apostle and everything as he is, it's still Christ that is going to save him. And it's just as it says in Romans, he is able to make a stand.
Yes.
It's only through him.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Especially if in just a moment here, we're going to get to verse number 6, and we're going to see that introspection that Greg just mentioned there. So looking here at verse number 5, though, before we get there, therefore judge nothing before the time until the Lord comes, who will both bring to light the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. Then each one's praise will come from God. Before it's time, before it's appropriate to judge, don't judge. In the idea that when the Lord comes, He's going to set it all right. He will. He's the judge of all the earth. Genesis 18, verse 25. The only time that the proper time for judgment is going to be, and whom it's by, is the Lord. On Judgment Day. He's going to judge. He says He's going to reveal the hidden things of darkness. What's He talking about there? Keep in mind who He's been talking to and who He's been talking about. You don't rank these preachers. God is going to reveal all the things that are hidden in the darkness. What's He saying? Darkness throughout Scripture is in reference to sin and evil. Yes, ma'am.
To me, this means there is nothing hidden.
Okay.
Obviously. So I think about when we're told about what Judgment Day will be like and how not everyone who comes to me and says, Lord, Lord, is actually going to make it into heaven. So clearly those people think, like you said, that they are right with God, but they're not, because they're holding themselves to a human standard.
Yes.
And I find it very difficult to not hold myself and others to a human standard. So this is a big struggle in my eyes, is to our heart, the what is going on in our heart means a lot.
Yes.
And it's, throughout right now especially, there's so many things that are going on that people outside of Christ think of as like we're hateful.
Yes.
What a hateful way to think, and what a bigoted way to think, and that's us holding things to a human standard. All of this is going to make sense in the end.
Yes. Yeah, the wisdom of man is foolishness to God. That's a great point. Looking here, let's try to draw this all together and make the point. Paul has been addressing the individuals, but contextually here the preacher, and he's saying God's going to shed light. Remember, they've been ranking the preachers. They've been holding them up. God's going to shed light on the hidden things of darkness and reveal the counsels of the hearts. And so, on the judgment day, things that we don't know about will be revealed. Don't think more highly of the preacher than you should, because there may be hidden things of darkness in that man's life. He said, look, you don't know me other than the moments that I've spoken to you in that time. So don't rank us, don't put us up on a pedestal, because there may be things in our lives that we are struggling with, that we are that they are in sin with, walking in darkness. He says God's going to reveal that in the end. Preachers are not perfect, and so we must be vigilant, all of us though, to aim for perfection. Yes, sir.
I really love how the Bible kind of goes back on itself. In Psalms 51, it talks about, for you do not desire sacrifice, or else I would give it. You do not delight in burnt offerings. And, the service that we do, I think, is necessary. The Lord's Supper, the prayer, whatever we do, it is necessary. And those are very important that we do this. But what's really important is verse 17. It says, the sacrifice of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. And it goes right back to the heart issue.
Yes.
We're judging other people. We're even judging ourselves. But it comes right down to it that when we step before the Creator, that's what's going to be judged, not our services. That will be burnt up.
Yes.
It's going to be our heart and what we decide, or how we do it.
Yes, sir. Great point. Yes, ma'am.
Going back to your point about not holding the preacher up, I think all of us have probably known situations where the church members were so infatuated with the preacher, and the preacher fell away, basically went into adultery
Right.
or
And that
fornication,
list is too long.
and the church fell apart.
Yes, because they're trusting in the preacher and not in God. That's a great point, and you've seen that throughout your life. Most of us have seen that. I'm only 30 and I've seen it. There's a lot of men that get caught up in those things. We need to be vigilant. We must be careful. So again, Paul is pointing out here, you're lifting us up to these standards when we are just men. There may be hidden things of darkness in our lives. You cannot put us on a pedestal, because we may not be right with God ourselves. We're the messengers of God here, and so we want to be. But he says, don't put us up. You need to be paying attention to God, to the message, because if not, you're going to have issues. You can fall apart, because if you put too much trust in the preacher, and the preacher fails, man fails, and he will at some point, your faith can fall apart, because it's not faith in God. It's faith in that man. The comments are all flowing together here. Yes, ma'am.
If we go back to Matthew chapter 7, verse 1 through 4, 5. Judge not that you be not judged, for with the judgment you pronounce you will be judged, and the measure you give will be the measure you get. Why do you see the speck that is in your brother's eye, but do not notice the log that is in your own eye? Or how can you say that your brother, let me take the speck out of your eye, when there is a log in your own eye? You're a hypocrite.
Yes, ma'am. No, that is a great verse to go back to, great context there. When we get to verse number 6 here in just a moment, we're going to see all those things y'all been mentioning here kind of come together to a head. Looking at the hidden things of darkness, going back to the heart issue, the broken and contrite heart. If our heart is not right with it, it's not going to matter how many times you came to service. It's not going to matter how many times you partook of the Lord's Supper. It's not going to matter how great you say we are. But it reveals the counsels of the heart. It's the decisions that we make. It's the motives that we have. What are yours? Those who may be seen as sound and strong may not be sound and strong. Especially if they go to a new place and they say, wait a second, this paycheck's a lot better than my last place. I don't really want to leave. What do they want to hear? Maybe I'll scratch some itching ears. What are your motives? What are your motives? The Lord knows the intents of the heart. Psalm 7 and verse number 9. Ultimately, this is a warning to the Corinthians. Again, you're putting these men up on pedestals and you don't even know what they might be doing outside or behind the scenes. You don't know what I might struggle with. You don't know my mind. I pray that through my actions you're able to see my character and my integrity. But that should be the goal of everyone. They fool themselves. They fool others. We need to be careful. We need to be vigilant in that. He says at the very end there, verse number 5, then each one's praise will come from God. This draws our mind back to Matthew 6 and verse number 16. How they have their reward to be seen by men. That's what they wanted. They wanted to look good and they sound good and they wanted that praise from men, and that's their praise. That's it. That's where it's going to stop. But he says the proper praise is going to come from God. That's what we want. We want proper praise from the Lord. Now, let's look at verses 6 through 10 here. This is going to really draw things together. Now these things, brethren, I have figuratively transferred to myself and Apollos for your sakes, that you may learn in us not to think beyond what is written, that none of you may be puffed up on behalf of one against the other. Why don't you just tell us what you really mean, Paul? He's bringing up the previous chapters and he's bringing them to a close. Don't exalt men, don't exalt me, don't exalt Apollos. You don't know who we truly are. You need to limit your preacheritis. You need to save it for Jesus. But he says, I'm now uncovering this issue here. Paul and Apollos, we weren't the issue. We weren't the issue. He says, I figuratively transferred these things to a different face, to someone else. He's going to illustrate the problem so they wouldn't agree that there's a problem. He's going to illustrate that there's an issue that needs to be handled and how to issue it, or how to handle it, But it's on someone else. It's projected on someone else. And so then they see these things. They say, yeah, that's a problem. That needs to be fixed. Here's how we're going to fix it. And Paul says, great, we all agree. Here's the thing. Here's your mirror. It's not Paul and Apollos. It's you. That's it's all coming to a head here. I figuratively transferred these things. Here is what you're doing, brothers and sisters in Corinth. I transferred these things. You needed to see it from someone else's perspective. You needed to get it away from yourself so that you would say, yes, I agree with that. Paul and Apollos have been the face of the problem. But then he says, you need to address these issues because you're the one with the problem. How many people do well when someone comes up to them and say, you need to fix this, 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 and this? I heard a laugh. It's because we don't do well with that. When we lay the groundwork for the issue, and we come to an agreement that such things are an issue, that there needs to be a problem solving going on, then we need to figure out what the solution is. Then we have to say, how can I apply it to myself? Does this bring up a story in the Old Testament in your mind by chance? It does to me. Remember Nathan when he came to David? He's explaining to him the story of the rich man and the poor man, and how the rich man had all these flocks, and he says, I'm not going to use any of my animals for my visitors coming in. I'm going to take the poor man's one lamb, and I'm going to sacrifice it. And David, he said, that man deserves to die. He should restore that lamb fourfold. What he did was wrong. I got my voice back if y'all haven't felt it. What he did was wrong. And then Nathan says, yes. But then what does he say? Thou art the man. You needed to see it from a different perspective so you would understand what is wrong, but then you have to take a hard look at yourself. Because when we hear it and we say, yeah, that's wrong, and this is wrong, and this needs to be fixed here, and here's how we're going to fix it, we can say that, but then all of a sudden when we go, wait, me? But you can't go back on agreeing that you just did this. You've already said, yeah, I agree that's wrong, or I agree that there's an issue here. This needs to be solved. Thou art the man. He did that for a reason. He says, so that you may learn not to think beyond what is written. Paul is applying this to the situation. Don't be thinking about anyone more so than what you see and know. He just got done discussing that in the verses prior. He says you need to keep your pedestals very small. They may be an inch off the ground. Don't raise them any higher. Don't raise them higher. Don't go above and beyond in praise towards someone with the idea of puffing one up. Pride was an issue here in Corinth. Later in the book, we're going to see that they were dealing with they were arguing over spiritual gifts. And we're going to see that here in just a minute. It's been said you can't believe your own press. Right? When we're writing about ourselves, we don't see that log in our eye that Gaylor brought up in Matthew 7. But that speck in our brother's eye looks really big. Looks really big. Introspection is needed. Now, in context, back to preachers. When a preacher delivers a message that hits home to you, it's okay to appreciate the preacher. Don't lift us up so much that was the best sermon I've ever heard, right? What we want to hear is, hey, I've never seen that verse in that light. I'm going to go back and study that context because that challenged me. That's the kind of thing that we get excited about, that I get excited about. It's okay to appreciate your preacher. Please appreciate your preacher. But don't puff me up. Church culture should be different from society's culture. Continuing on here in verse number 7. Unless there's a question or comment on verse number 6. Alrighty. Verse number 7. For who makes you differ from one another? And what do you have that you did not receive? Now if you did not receive it, or if you did indeed receive it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? Now what's he talking about? We mentioned just a minute ago, and we haven't gotten there yet in the text, but they have spiritual gifts that they're arguing over. Miraculous spiritual gifts in this time that they're arguing over. But they also have the gospel. But they received those spiritual gifts. We're going to see that all the way in chapter 12. And the question is, why are you comparing one another if you both got a spiritual gift? You're comparing two different men as teachers who both received spiritual gifts, and you're comparing their gifts when they're from the same source. There should be no comparing going on here. Paul had laid hands on them, Acts chapter 8, and that allowed them to have the knowledge of the gospel. It allowed them to have to do miracles. It allowed them to have discernment. And they're arguing about them. My gift's better than your gift, right? Like little kids. I've got a better spiritual gift than you because I can, whatever. I don't know what the gifts are. They were all received. That's what Paul's pointing out. You all got this from God, and you're arguing about it. Let's apply that to us today. What have we all received from God if we have obeyed His commands? Salvation. And sometimes we argue about that. What causes us to forget where things come from? You ever heard there's a gentleman that I grew up around. He used to always tell his kids, before they left the door, he'd hug them, he'd say, don't forget where you came from. What causes us to forget where we came from? Someone say it? Pride? Arrogance? Right? Remember the lepers, the 10 lepers that Jesus healed? He healed all of them the same. Luke chapter 17, how many came back and thanked Him? 1. They had been out of the camp for so long. Jesus heals them, and immediately they forget. We can be like that sometimes. If we begin to focus on our blessings as things that maybe I've earned, or that I get to enjoy these things, and we forget there's a blesser in them, we need to be careful. All of this is God's wisdom. It's not mine. It's not original with me. God is the author. And the Corinthians were boasting in gifts that they received from God. It was a gift. Now, we don't have spiritual gifts today, but we have Scripture. We have the gospel delivered to us. We have salvation if we've accepted that gospel. Verse number 8, he tells them, you are already full. You are already rich. You have reigned as kings without us, and indeed I wish you did reign, that we might also reign with you. You have the knowledge. You're spiritually rich. Paul leaves Corinth, and then those who have the spiritual gifts, they say, okay, it's my turn. I'm going to be the next Paul. I'm going to lift myself up higher. That's my opportunity to shine. He says, I wish you did reign, that we might also reign with you. I wish that you hadn't looked at it as an individual effort, that you're better than someone else, but that it's a collective effort together, that we could be in this together, servants and stewards of God. I really want to get to verse 10, but we're about to get out. Okay, we're gonna stop right there because verse 9 and 10, they're too good to rush through. So next week we'll pick up in verse number 9. We'll be looking at 9 and 10 and try to get through. We might be able to get to the end of chapter next week. No promises, as usual. Thank you for your time and attention this morning. Great comments. We're looking forward to worshiping our God together.